Chapter 12. The icy wind blasted them as they headed toward the ship. It seemed to Lucas just as well that it made hearing so difficult, as he had no desire to have a conversation with anyone, except perhaps Michael, who forged the divine keys and guided their destiny. Everything that they had tried to undo had happened anyway. His thoughts returned to his conversation with Stephanie Mason on the way down. She had been convinced that they could change destiny. The fact that she could see possibilities had reinforced the idea that they could defeat the destroyer and prevent the catastrophic change in the Earth's rotation that had relegated humankind in the next centuries to a pathetic existence where slavery, demon worship, and brutality reigned. He leaned into the wind as he stepped forward. He risked turning his head to look at the others. Everyone appeared to be feeling as he did. Their heads were lowered as they pressed toward their destination. Sig, who had almost always been the cheerful one in the group, had his head lowered as he carried Jennifer through the snow. Jennifer had not regained consciousness after using her time-bending abilities to get everyone to the pole, and even though Sig was not radiating happiness after their battle with Abaddon, he had regained his physical strength. Lizard walked next to Victor behind Sig and Jennifer. Although Lizard could have teleported himself somewhere more comfortable and there were no conversations of interest, he wanted to stay with the others. Row 82 rubbed the metal plates behind his ears. While they were of help in locating Abaddon and perceiving his intentions to free the Archdemon, they had been in the cold long enough that they conducted heat away from his body. He shivered in the wind. Stephanie lowered her head as she trudged through the snow. Lucas pressed his lips together as he watched her. He knew that she was feeling terrible guilt for having come up with the strategy that twisted the rotation of the planet. But she also knew that it had been the only way to stop the awakening of the Archdemon. Though he had not seen the same visions of the future to know what would have happened had the Archdemon awakened, he assumed that she had made the best decision. He turned forward again as he walked. He decided that he needed to try to separate himself from his feelings of sympathy and regret. After all, his friends would be looking to him for guidance and direction when they got out of Antarctica. Lucas took a deep breath. The cold air hurt his lungs, but he embraced the pain and thought about their options. They could try and return to their own time and improve life there. Making a list of slavers and demon worshippers to take down had been the obvious course before they attempted to change history. Another choice was to stay in this time and help to solve as many problems as they could. Since it was their coming back in time that had brought the destroyer and ruined life for these people, it seemed appropriate to do what they could to improve life for those that survived. It also would allow them to explore by observation the events that shaped the world into which they had been born. Even if they were unable to alter the major events of their past, understanding them could help them make a more informed decision about what to do next. The other option was one that Stephanie had suggested earlier, to go back and try to change the past at an earlier point in order to prevent the catastrophe in which they had just taken part. In light of their role in bringing the destroyer back in time with them and then altering the rotation of the Earth, Lucas determined that changing the past before having a better understanding of how time travel affected outcomes was a bad choice. Although it was difficult to tell in the darkness what time of day it was, they decided to camp for a time. Sig used his shield to compact snow, and Kirana used the Heaven's Sword to slice bricks of ice. Lizard quickly assembled the bricks using his teleportation until he had constructed a shelter. Even though the temperatures were still low, the shelter from the wind was a welcome relief for the weary group as they entered the ice building. "We need to get a fire going," said Victor as he pulled out a small can of stove fuel. "I'm not sure that's going to be enough," said Lizard with air quotes. "Can you get something more?" asked Victor. Lizard teleported away. A few minutes later, he reappeared with a pair of small tanks and heaters attached. "What are those?" asked Victor. "Something called fuel cell heaters," said Lizard. "They're supposed to be safe inside." "That works," said Victor. Within minutes they were gathered between the heaters to get feeling back into their limbs. Victor went around and healed the frostbite that had started in their ears and fingers. Though it was painful, they seemed more apathetic to it than they had in previous healings. He could hardly blame them after all they had seen that day. The orange glow of the fuel cell heaters gave a soft, warm color to the ice inside their shelter. The dried blood stains on Lizard's cloak made Victor shudder. Having healed him, he knew the price that Lizard had paid to give them their opportunity to defeat Abaddon was higher than the others realized. Even after his ordeal, he was concerned with the comfort of his friends more than himself. "Thank you, Lizard," said Victor in a low tone. Lizard nodded, seeming to understand what Victor wanted to express. He went and attended to Jennifer, who was still unconscious. "So what now?" said Kirana at last. Lucas knew he needed to speak before Stephanie, and got to his feet. "We came back to this time to stop the destroyer and save the future," said Lucas. "We did not properly understand time travel and ended up being used by it." Stephanie frowned, but did nothing further to object. Lucas's logic seemed sound. "I do not think it is wise to attempt more time travel for the time being," continued Lucas, "even though what we were forced to do was the best of our very limited options. Millions of people in this time will suffer tremendously because of our actions. I think it would be best to stay here and do what we can to help the people of this age. Then, once we understand more about what is going on right now, we can return to the idea of time travel." "That sounds best," said Sig softly. As Lucas inventoried the reactions of his allies, he realized that his advice would be accepted. He breathed in a large volume of cold air and then slowly exhaled. Although he had been confident that his position was correct, he was unsure of what the intense emotions they had all experienced in their fight with Abaddon might provoke. With his mind set at rest that they would not rush immediately to time travel, he began to realize the fuel cell heaters were actually beginning to make him feel uncomfortably warm, and he removed his pack. "Hey, we've got some food in here," he said as he reached into his bag and retrieved a plastic-wrapped box. "Anyone up for chicken?" "I'll take it," said Jonathan enthusiastically. Lucas tossed it to him. He sliced open the packaging by pulling it against one of his sharp swords. "Wow," he said as he opened the packaging and took a bite. "That's disgusting." "It's better than nothing," said Kirana in an upset tone as she approached to get a bite of Jonathan's meal. He held the plastic container out as she pulled out a small piece of chicken and bit into it. The dry, rubbery texture was not helped by the seasonings in the packaging, and she shuddered as she swallowed it. "But not much better," said Jonathan with a smile. "Could you do better?" asked Kirana. "Well, yes, actually," replied Jonathan, "if I had the right stuff." "Tell me what you need, Jonathan," said Lizard as he spit out a bite from the meal that he had taken. "I think the meat in this has gone bad." "Really?" asked Jonathan excitedly. "Really," said Lucas as he spit out a bite himself. Stephanie smiled at Lucas's contorted facial expression. Lucas looked away in embarrassment. "I don't know what your problem is," said Sig as he took another large bite of his meal. "The meat is actually spoiled," said Row 82 as he looked at a morsel he had retrieved from his package. "I recommend you stop eating, Sig." Sig frowned but retrieved a package of crackers from his bag and smiled widely. "No meat in this, though," he said as he tore open the packaging and shoved a cracker into his mouth. Jonathan quickly assembled a list of items that he wanted and gave it to Lizard. Within minutes, Lizard had teleported back and forth dozens of times, bringing a portable stove, pots, pans, packages of meat, beans, plump tomatoes, and seasonings. Jonathan immediately began preparing his concoction of ingredients, and before long a pleasant odor flowed through their ice shelter. "I didn't know you could do this," said Kirana in an impressed tone. "Yeah, I actually ran into the remains of a restaurant in the hot zone," said Jonathan. "I obviously couldn't use any of the meat or vegetables, but they had some flashy menus, spices, and a recipe book. Sam and I got creative with some of the desert plants, dates, and snake meat." "I thought you just ate raw stuff in a cave," said Kirana. "Well, I did at first," said Jonathan, "but after rescuing Sam, we could afford to do better. There were enough supplies in the restaurant to last a couple weeks before the water supply ran out." The meal was ready after a short time, and everyone took a bowl full of Jonathan's culinary product. Jonathan smiled as he watched them devour the meals excitedly. Even Row 82 seemed to enjoy the flavor of the food. "Totally worth it," said Lizard with air quotes. "Absolutely," said Sig with a loud laugh. Bits of food sprayed out of his mouth all around and onto Jennifer. Victor shot a disapproving look at him, but found it difficult to maintain his disapproval when he saw the look on Sig's face. Stephanie and Kirana both took their bowls to get additional servings. There was a moment of awkwardness as Jonathan looked at the two of them, but he quickly served them both. "Jonathan, I..." started Kirana as she lingered, holding her bowl filled with Jonathan's meal. "This is really good," she said at last. Jonathan smiled widely. Stephanie took her bowl to the spot in which she had been sitting near the fuel cell heater to find Lucas there. She looked around for another spot in which to sit, but Lucas motioned for her to come closer. Reluctantly, she approached and sat down. "Are you all right?" asked Lucas. She nodded her head and shoveled a spoonful of Jonathan's stew into her mouth. The awkwardness of the conversation was quickly overcome by the harmony of flavors and the textures in the food. Most of the food she had eaten in the past was only consumed to prevent starvation. Eating had been a necessity as a slave. Here, in spite of the freezing temperatures in Antarctica and the circumstances in which they found themselves, Stephanie closed her eyes and relished the meal. "Stephanie?" prompted Lucas again. She opened her eyes and nodded. Lucas smiled and cleared his throat. "I'm just wondering. Well, He scratched the back of his head awkwardly. Stephanie frowned at his odd behavior. "I was just wondering if you had any visions. I mean, I was planning on studying the past to see if I could get a better perspective on the end of the Golden Age, but I don't know exactly what to expect." Stephanie shook her head. Lucas frowned and looked away. "Okay," he said. "I wish that I could get information more quickly from my key. I mean, you seem to have had a lot of visions." Stephanie did not want to risk using her tablet to speak in the cold, but if she had been speaking, she would have told Lucas how unpleasant it was to be spontaneously sucked out of consciousness and thrust into the swirling confusion of a vision of the future. Lucas pulled the key of origins out from under his shirt and looked at it, as if it might say something if he waited long enough. Its mirrored surface reflected the soft orange light of the fuel cell heaters and created an almost hypnotic effect. Stephanie found herself entranced for a moment. Finally, she blinked her eyes and took another spoonful of her stew. She was caught off guard as Lucas slumped down on the icy floor. She took hold of his shoulders and tried to stir him. His eyes slowly opened to reveal a bright glow. She looked down at his key and noticed that it had also begun glowing. Had Stephanie been able to speak, she would have reprimanded him for not being more careful about what he had wished.